When it comes to the origins of medieval culture, way of rule, way of life, and pretty much everything, there are three lines of tradition or origin from ancient times. The three main pillars of the Middle Ages, if you will. Roman culture, Christianity, and Germanic culture. Oversimplified, these three mixed and essentially created the Middle Ages most people have in mind. If you think of any medieval monarch, like Richard the Lionheart, or Charlemagne, or Frederick Barbarossa, pretty much everything they experienced in their home regions was derived from either of these three pillars. To complete the picture, there are two further pillars that are of less importance to the Middle Ages. To be clear, this does not mean they were not important, they just didn't contribute as much to the general Western and Central European Middle Ages most people in the West have in mind when they are talking about Middle Ages. And the core elements that I am going to talk about in this video have no, or at most barely any influence from those pillars. These pillars are Slavic culture and Islam. And since I'm already talking about the contents of this video, I'll cover the first two pillars here, the third pillar in the next one, and the others some way down the line once they will be relevant. So, let's start with the first pillar, Roman culture. While the history of the late Roman Empire is vast, I will only cover those aspects that are relevant to the Middle Ages, beginning in the 3rd century AD. By that time, the empire was more or less in constant crisis, with 30 soldier emperors that had used their position as military commander and couped themselves to emperordom, and 41 usurpers who had attempted a coup, but were unsuccessful within just 50 years. Attempts to end this crisis and to stabilize the empire under Diocletian and Constantine the Great led to several reforms. The first one is a change in the self-image of the Roman emperor. Past historians have called this shift the change from the earlier principate, as begun by Augustus, to the dominate. In theory, this meant a stronger, absolute, godlike ruler and lawgiver. The godlike role also meant the vicinity of the emperor became considered godly, or sacred. The palace became a sacred palace, the emperor itself became sacred. That's, by the way, why the Holy Roman Empire calls itself that. Sacrum Imperium, holy, or better, sacred empire. The differences between military and civilian bureaucracy were eliminated, uniting both into one streamlined bureaucracy with 4 tiers: prefecture, diocese, province, and civitas, which is a city and its surroundings. This made the administration more rational and effective and helped in centralizing the empire. There were also tax and currency reforms, which, for example, introduced the gold coin, the solidus, and which were generally aimed at allowing for more military spending. The military was also reformed. It was now directly controlled by the emperor himself, resulting in effectively a military dictatorship, or as some historians have put it, a militaristic absolutism. Directly underneath the emperor, a new office, the Magister Militum, was created, similar to either a commander-in-chief or a war theater commander. The, for this video especially, important characteristic of this new office was that it wasn't limited to Romans. Non-Romans, like Germanic people, could become Magister Militum, and several were, including the Visigothic king Alaric I or the Burgundian king Gondioc. At the same time, there were also social changes, some driven by top-down reform, other occurring more natural. The first important one is that the liberties of the Roman citizen were increasingly limited. Citizens became subjects. As a side note, liberty or freedom at that time does not have the same meaning as it has today. Our modern understanding is very much influenced by the Enlightenment and its idea of innate freedom or liberty that every human possesses. This simply wasn't the idea people had of freedom before the Enlightenment. Instead, freedoms, as well as rights, were legal statuses that could be granted or revoked. For example, in German medieval and early modern law, Vogelfreiheit, meaning the state of being free like a bird, was seen as a punishment, as when one was given ultimate freedom, one also lost all protection. Side note over. Where were we? Right, social changes. With the above mentioned tax reforms also came tax privileges for certain social groups, primarily the military, later the church, and the upper class in general, who were all exempt from paying taxes. This meant that the lower class now had to stem the tax burden on their own. This in turn meant that there were two ways to make sure one didn't have to pay taxes: join the army or join the church. Therefore, careers in those fields were incentivized. In the civitates, the cities, laws were implemented that made the decurions and curials, essentially the town councils, be liable for the city's taxes, which in turn made these offices unattractive. By the 4th century, several reforms also affected the rural populace. Coloni glebae adscripti. The colony, the tenants, were legally bound to the land. At the same time, urban flight, especially among the elite, increased. Land property was considered to be a good investment, and it allowed them to become more self-sufficient. Some even could go so far as to recruit their own little armies, with which they would drive imperial tax collectors away. Seeing this apparent power of the landlords, many coloni voluntarily put themselves under the landlord's protection, an act that in Latin was called patrocinio, which, by the way, is related to the word patron. Speaking of which, maybe consider being my patron by subscribing to this channel. Anyway, by the 5th century, it were not the coloni that were taxed, but the landlords. This in turn led to the idea that not the emperor was the lord of the colony, but the respective landlord, who would still receive the rent from the colony. With the landlords now also increasingly bearing senatorial titles, we have reached a point where the rural society in the late Roman Empire very much looks like the medieval feudal society. We have a land-owning nobility, in sources varyingly called potentes, the powerful, nobiles, the noble ones, or honoratiores, the honored ones, and then the increasingly unfree coloni, tenants, peasants, villains, who the sources call pauperes, the poor, or humiliores, the lower ones. To those coloni, the freed slaves were added, who became more and more, since slavery lost its significance in the late antiquity and was virtually unimportant in the Middle Ages. In total, these reforms led to a stabilization of the empire, although to the detriment of the middle and lower classes. Among the nobility, the urban flight led to a decrease in interest to the continuing existence of the empire, as those noblemen sat in their villas in the countryside with their own private armies. They simply didn't need the empire anymore. On to the second pillar, Christianity. I'm going to assume that everyone watching has some idea how the situation for Christians in the Roman Empire was, before the 4th century, that is. By the 4th century, of the approximately 50 million inhabitants of the Roman Empire, 7 million were Christians. For anyone too lazy to calculate it, that's 14% of the population. At that point, the majority of the Christians lived in the eastern half of the empire, where Christianity also originated. Under the Eastern Emperor Galerius, the persecutions ended with the Edict of Serdica in 311, which was followed by the Edict of Milan under Constantine the Great, which essentially confirmed the previous edict. Constantine's story is well known, I suppose, so I won't go into too much detail here. Constantine supposedly had a vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where a voice, presumably God or Jesus, told him to paint the G rho symbol on his soldiers' shields with the Latin words "in hoc signo vinces." Under this sign you will win. Constantine won the battle and thereon was nice to the Christians. At this point, Constantine was already a follower of a monotheistic religion, the so-called cult of Sol Invictus, the undefeated or unconquered sun. So changing Sol into Jesus wasn't as huge of a step. While Galerius only tolerated Christians, Constantine, while only converting on his deathbed, supported Christianity. So, throughout the 4th century, Christianity became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. This allowed the Christians to build up the infrastructure and organization that many Christian churches use to this day. In 380, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the sole state religion of the empire. Now, with state support, the Christians could organize themselves, and in doing so, they oriented themselves on the Roman state and structured the church by copying the Roman state dioceses, which were then headed by the episcopus, which is the modern bishop. The bishop, at this point in time, was elected by the clerics, but also the laymen, or non-clerics, so in total by everyone in their respective dioceses. To the bishops then also came the archbishops, who were higher in the hierarchy than other bishops, but this is important, this only means that they were more esteemed, and not that they could order the bishops around. Above these archbishops, there then were the 5 patriarchs, 4 from the, at that point, largest cities within the empire: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, as well as Jerusalem, which was added due to its importance in Judeo-Christian traditions. Now, both archbishops and patriarchs were bishops themselves. The difference, again, lies within an honorary precedence before other bishops. The Bishop of Rome held not only as patriarch, but also as successor to St. Peter, a special honorary precedence over the other bishops. The only entity higher than the patriarchs was the Ecumenic Council, which was an assembly of all bishops, whereby majority religious questions and disputes were resolved. And this council, actually had the power to tell bishops what to do. This also means that at this time the church had a comparably democratic system, especially in contrast to the top-down structure of the empire itself. The bishops were elected by the people, and they then formed essentially something like a parliament. Now, granted, the Ecumenic Council didn't convene on the regular basis, but only when there was a concrete reason to do so. And it was also usually the emperor who had the council convened. The reason for this is quite simple. The emperor wanted to use Christianity to unite the empire. They wanted a state religion that is the same throughout the empire. You can't have a state religion that is different in every region. So the best way to make sure everyone agrees on it is to have everyone come together and discuss. Now, in the very first larger dispute, the emperor wasn't involved at first. It arose over the question whether Christians who had denied their beliefs during the persecutions were still Christians, and especially important, if sacraments given by these Christians were lawful. This was highly controversial, and it is no coincidence that the Latin term for those Christians, traditor, is the root of the modern English word traitor. When in 314 it came out that the Bishop of Carthage, Caecilian, was elected with the participation of one such traditor, it resulted in quite a ruckus. Those that claimed that the traditors were, traitors are called Donatists, after a later Bishop of Carthage called Donatus. Caecilian requested the help of Emperor Constantine, who had the first ecumenical council convene at Alais. That council agreed that the Donatists were wrong. The traditors had been rightfully forgiven and welcomed back into the church. Caecilian, therefore, was the rightful Bishop of Carthage. The Donatists disagreed and thereon considered the other Christians to be excommunicated. But with this precedent set, the emperor was involved and thus started a discussion that would go on for centuries, and in some regions it is still current, how the state and church relate to each other. A very early answer to this comes from Pope Gelasius I, who formulated the so-called doctrine of the two powers, or more figuratively speaking, of the two swords, as it was commonly adapted during the Middle Ages. The basic idea is this: There are two powers, later symbolized by swords, that God bestows on mankind. One, the regalis potestas, or worldly power, given to the emperor, and the other, the sacrata auctoritas, or spiritual power, given to the church, or specifically the pope. In principle, both powers are equal, and pope and emperor should support each other. But metaphysically speaking, the spiritual power had precedence, as it was the one that guaranteed salvation. This idea that Pope and Emperor held different powers is essentially the seedling from which the modern separation of state and church grew from, at least in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Donatists weren't the only Christians with differing views. There are many groups, in fact, with differing importance, and the exact theological problems don't matter that much. The important thing is to know they existed. Maybe in the future I'll do a video on them. For now, I will only mention the names. First were the Arians, named after Bishop Arius, and they played an important role as some emperors and many Germanic people belonged to them. Then the Nestorians, who were the base for the modern Eastern churches in Syria, Iraq, India, and historically much of Asia. And lastly, the Mono or Miaphysites, who were and still are the majority of the Armenian, Egyptian, and Ethiopian Christians. The split with the Miaphysites on the Council of Chalcedon, however, bears a special importance. The Miaphysites lived primarily within the empire, and remember, the goal of making Christianity the state religion was to unite the empire under one religion. When the Nestorians and Arians were condemned as heretics, it wasn't a problem, since most of their followers lived outside the empire. But with the Miaphysites, in one go the emperor antagonized the majority of the population of Egypt and eastern Anatolia, as well as huge parts of the Levant. Especially since Egypt, the breadbasket of the Eastern Empire, was now angry at the empire. It should be clear that this isn't a good situation. So, to summarize, after a century of crisis, the empire reforms into an authoritarian, theocratic military dictatorship with an absolute ruler, while the nobility tries to do their own thing in the countryside. Christianity brought some stability, but that is already crumbling again, and we haven't even talked about the Germanic factor. But at this point, this video is already long enough in my opinion, so I will leave the Germanic people for the next video, possibly next month. If you want to see that, consider subscribing, so you won't miss it. If you liked the video, leave a like and perhaps a comment, and thanks for watching, see you next time.